So on that note, I'm going to pass over to Indy Johar. He probably doesn't need any introduction, so I'm just going to let him do his own. Thank you so much.
Good morning. To be really honest, it's such a pleasure to start the day listening to Sarah and Emmy and set the tone for what I think is a really important conversation. So firstly, just a big thank you for Sarah and Emmy on building this. And it is really incredible what you guys are doing and how you're creating the context. So thank you. Look, the other context I really want to share is that I think when I was a little bit younger and a little bit naive, I used to sort of kind of going, yeah, we gotta, this is all wrong, this is where we need to go. And I think over the years, I think one of the things I've just realized is that we're all standing on each other's learnings. And actually the privilege of learning, of exploring something and learning something and then sharing it back is really important. And I think I've often been part of misunderstanding even the world around me or the kind of limits around me. So I want to frame this conversation from a kind of, this is what we've been learning. And they may not be right as well, right? I don't hold the gospel on the future. I just hold a perspective, and I think we've got incredible people here today throughout the day, and many of you in the room that will know aspects of this better than I will, almost certainly. But what I hope it does, it sets a frame for a conversation to be had for all of us to get smarter together. So I just want to frame that, and I think it's really important to just acknowledge that we are standing on each other's shoulders in many ways. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to talk about dark matter, actually. I'm kind of what I really want to talk about is, like, what does the future hold, and what do I think? What are we learning about the next 10 years, and what the nature of the next 10 years that we're talking about? One of the things I've just become slightly frustrated by is that people talk about the future as if it's a linear projection of what we've experienced in the last 20 years. And I think it's really delusional. And I'm going to start to show you some of the numbers and some of the things that are actually on the table. And people like Rupert Reed, who I just think extraordinary leaders in the space, who've been telling us for years some of this stuff. And we've not really been listening. And I think there's also a degree of humility that we have to bring to the table to actually listen to some of the people that have been saying this stuff viscerally over the years and putting lives and other forms of sacrifices on the table. So I just think it's really important to start that way. I don't know how many of you can see this. Oh, God, I'm sorry. It's converted to a PDF, which means that the resolution will be really poor. But anyway, look, this is between 2 and 2.5 degrees projected climate change, and it's sort of temperature change. This is outside historical human niche zones, deep red. And what you start to see is vast tracts of the world become deep red by 2070. That means it moves outside historical human niche zones. So when people say, oh, we got 1.2 billion people on the move, what they're referring to is this sort of stuff. Like real structural shifts in the geography of the planet and its capacity to host humans in the way that we're talking about. And I don't think we're quite realizing this is of a greater significance than World War II. Like, we think of World War II as a big thing. This is magnitudes larger than that. And what it will drive to human population movements and vast amounts of stories. And just to give you a horrific, and I'm sorry to start, I will be that sort of slightly depressing guy. Like, if you talk to some of the people that are looking at existential risk and some of the systemic risk, they say there's a likelihood in the next 20 years, a 90% chance we will face a 100 million person event in the next 20 years, where 100 million people will be massively affected by climate breakdown. I think it's really important, from my understanding, to call it climate breakdown rather than climate change. Climate is the idea of predictable weather. If you break climate, you lose the idea of predictable weather. And the loss of predictability of weather has massive implications for the world around us. And then I think it's just like linguistically, you're all hearing this stuff, but people say, you know, we're almost certainly not going to hit 1.5 degrees. Like, that's all, you know, the consensus increasingly. And remember, the IPCC reports are conservative. They're not the kind of even the middle case scenarios, they're the conservative scenarios. And if you talk to many of the people, they say our current policy landscape is likely to hit us at 3 degrees, between 3.3 degrees to 6 degrees. So if you look at some of the military analysts, they're saying our current policy landscape's probably hit us close to 6 degrees. 6 degrees, by the way, is not a joke. 6 degrees is perhaps outside human livable environments for most of us, right? Now, language like 3 degrees, you'll hear it all the time. And I'm gonna use a session to slightly unpack these conversations. You'll hear language like 3 degrees. What does 3 degrees really mean? 3 degrees global average means 5 degrees land temperature, means closer to 8 degrees in urban environments like Birmingham. So what is a 32-degree temperature, summer temperature, will be closer to 40 degrees, right? Now, this is why these numbers matter, and it also numbers matter for us to understand when people talk about this, what the implications are. Now, let's just also put some things behind that. 3 degrees basically means we lose a global food basket between about 1.7 to 1.9 degrees. The likelihood of losing one of our major food baskets is very high, between 1.7 to 1.9 degrees. We're already projected to lose almost certainly the glaciers in the Alps by 2070. Now, the loss of glaciers in the Alps means we lose predictable water systems, i.e. river systems, which means our agriculture systems become fragile. Right? Now, why I'm saying this is because it is in that context that we're talking about change. And then, you know, at a global level, I mean, I would really recommend Kate Raworth's work on this and how she communicates some of this. But basically, if that's population and carbon emissions and material footprint and GDP, these have all been almost one-to-one. Yes, there's some talk right now that a few countries, about 26 countries, are delaminated from carbon and GDP being one-to-one. But I think if you look at material footprints and other things, it's still pretty closely tied together. So our society, our civilization, has been almost tightly correlated with producing carbon, tightly correlated with that carbon being linked to GDP, and tightly correlated with our material consumption. And what we face is a transformation and a delamination of all of that in a really structural sense. And I think this is also, you know, you get sort of conversations like 2% growth. What does 2% growth mean? That in 25 years, right? That is what it means. Like, these numbers look artificial, small, marginal, but you have to start to understand what the serious implications of it are in terms of scale. Now, I'm going to try to manifest this in our everyday realities. You've got politicians, I've got nothing against them, I'm not going to say anything bad about them, but just, you've got politicians who will say, look, we've got a housing crisis in the UK, we need to build 300,000 homes. Another politician will say, no, I'm going to build 350,000 homes, right? But if you look, the UK is a signatory of the Paris Accord, right, as is pretty much all European countries. If you look at our national carbon budgets, how many homes do you think we can afford to build? It's not quite zero, but it's pretty close. It's about 14,000 homes, right? That's excluding us doing any retrofit, by the way. So if we do any retrofit, we don't have that carbon budget. Now, why I'm saying that is that on one hand, there's a kind of Paris Accords. On the other hand, we have policy around spatial justice, which are just no longer linked together. And so we're having these delusional conversations around actually how do we solve our spatial justice issues with a kind of a framework that is never going to do it because we don't have the national carbon budgets to be able to do that. And I think it's really important to start to have these honest conversations, not to say we still have a spatial justice problem. We need to solve that in a different way. We're not going to be able to solve it by building new homes because we don't have the capacity to be able to do that. So how do we have a new form of spatial justice conversations around that? It becomes really critical. And then I think, again, I'm going to do some of the numbers behind this because I think it's really important for us to ground this stuff. This is embodied carbon. A typical new build is about 800 kilograms of embodied carbon per meter squared. The best low carbon home is 150 kilograms of embodied carbon, right? Because remember, embodied carbon is now important because you can't just say, oh, so the best retrofit, green retrofit house, right, is 125 kilograms per meter squared, the best, right? Deep retrofit. It takes 21 years to make that net zero, i.e. to pull that carbon back out, 21 years. We unfortunately don't have the space to do a carbon volcano and pull it back out of the air. We've lost the time zones for that. Where we need to be is 6.3. That's less than 5% of that embodied carbon. Then if you look at the materiality of that, there are basically about 3 materials that actually work at that landscape level. So I'm not saying this to scare us or to do, what I'm saying this to say, for us to know what we're talking about, right? So when you say we're going to build a bespoke, this is the best house you can build, pretty much. What you have to do is release a huge amount of carbon, then you hope to be able to suck back out. And what the numbers are starting to tell us, and again, I'm open to the numbers being challenged, I'm open to this conversation, right, is that actually our thesis no longer works. And that is problematic. So the other part of it, is that many of us as architects will talk around saying we're going to do timber, right? Timber construction, we're going to solve this with timber construction. And the things to bear in mind, we need, if we sequester carbon, we need to store that carbon for about 200 years. Right? So now start to think about using your timber and sequestering that carbon for 200 years. It's not that I've just used timber because I've got this little I walked into this hotel in Netherlands and somebody gave me this timber what is it, Wi-Fi wireless card. I was like, what the fuck is this? What's the lifespan of that? And I think we have to be really considerate about this, really deeply considerate. And already we know we don't actually have the timber supply to deal with the demand that we're talking about. That's already on constraint. And remember, this is managed timber that we've got to do. We've got to look at managed timber, i.e. 40-year forests that are being managed and harvested very selectively, and we've got to not deplete our soils, which all of our current monoforestry systems are depleting and destroying fundamental soil systems. Right, here's a sort of simple provocation. How many of you guys are vegan? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, 7. Right, guys, you guys are not Trump, right? You guys are smart, clever, logical people. This is cattle. That is chicken in all the world. That is goats. That's sheep, pigs, horses. That's all the wild animals in the world. All of them. Zebras, elephants, pick whatever you like. We use vast amounts of our soil system to keep this alive and to feed on animals. One of the big challenges we've got is that our food systems are massively destroyed, at the heart of destroying our forest systems right now. And the pressure we're putting on our food systems means that also we cannot build the biomaterial economy that most people end up talking about as being the source of our next economy. So I often say this, and I'm not fully vegan either, but I just say this, that you're the smartest kind of data-driven, fact-driven lot in the world, yet we're not able to make the choices that are pretty evidently clean to us. Then there really isn't much of a debate left. And if there was, I mean, yes, you can make a marginal debate on sort of, yes, if it's organic, blah, blah, but actually it's not equitable. We can get nowhere close to it. So why I'm saying this is that I think we've really got to start. And these food systems, without making our food system shift, we can't make our land use shift. And without making the land use shift, we don't get a biomaterial economy that we're going to need in probably 20, 30 years' time. So these things are linked. We're going to see a fundamental shift in our land use. And that's going to be a key part of it. And remember, our land is going to be soil is becoming more fragile as climate change accelerates. So there's double forms of pressure on this system in really hard ways. And then just worth, again, knowing the reality of these conversations. So in 2019 to 2020, 1 year, our global energy demand went up greater than all the installed renewables. The demand in global energy increase was greater than all the installed renewables. Now, why I say that is you often have technologists saying, hey, look at the price of solar. It's doing this. Yeah, it is. But currently, it's just largely replacing, it's basically just dealing with our demand. demand increase. It's not dealing with our baseload energy that we've got. And this is catastrophically large. Now, people, again, I stand on the shoulders of other great people. Listen to people like Nate Higgins, who's a really brilliant thinker on energy systems and the energy crisis that we're facing. Because we're not actually in the middle of truths around this. And if you go to energy ministries now, this is where it starts to get a little bit hopeful. So if you go to Swedish energy ministry, they're saying, look, we don't have enough energy after 2025. We cannot provide it. Right? And then you get people saying, we're going to electrify our cities. Right? That's often the conversation. I'm in Stockholm, many parts of the world. We're going to electrify all our cities, and say, that's great. And then say, okay, where's your copper coming from? Now, again, it's all in the nuance here. This is why I'm really going. There is enough copper supply reserves in the world. Yes. Let's assume that's true. However, copper mines take about 10 years to unlock. If you look at our 10-year window where we've got to do most of this work, it isn't available. Second part of the problem is that actually our mining infrastructure is 90% responsible for our ecological destruction right now. So what are we trading here? What are we going to trade as we move from one to the other? And do we have the time space for it? Time is a really key component in our decisions. Not absolute, but the time frames available to us. And I think I'm just saying this because this starts to change, certainly for us, the worldview of what is possible, what is necessary, and what's the sequence of what's necessary. And it's also worth knowing, civilization as a whole is literally a one-to-one correlation, or the complexity of civilization as a whole is a one-to-one correlation with energy. Energy. In 1920s, it would take 1 barrel of oil to unlock 120 barrels of oil. Now, 1 barrel of oil unlocks 7 barrels of oil. So we've already gone through peak energy availability in leverage terms. And now we're having to spend more and more energy to get that quantum of energy out. So we're already in a regressive cycle. And that's really important for us to understand about what this shift starts to look like. And then, again, I just want to keep grounding it. And so I'm going to be that boring guy that's slightly depressing. But this is using Finnish data because it's kind of available. Average Finn, actually it's about 11.5 tons per person, average Finn, of total carbon. This is on the carbon side. This is if you go vegetarian, buy a solar collector, recycle products, use public transport. Can't read that one. Yeah, all the normal things that we talk about. That's what you can do with all the normal things. And why I say that, that's if everyone does that, you still have all those white bits left. And why that's important to say is my number one thing is that we are looking at a substantive transformation of our lives. It is not going to be fixed by putting a solar pump and putting a battery system and an air source heat pump, and we're okay. Just isn't that simple. I wish it were. I wish we could say that, but it isn't that simple. And I'll give you a sort of quote. So this shirt, I don't do expensive shirts. It's about £35, right? It's a shirt. I worn it. But if you did true cost analysis on social and environmental costs, it's closer to £250 to £450. Not 1.2 factorial. It is significant factorial. Now, that means, so what does that mean? When I bought this shirt for £35, I released into the world somewhere between 215 to 315 pounds of liabilities and losses into the world. I bought it for 35. I released the rest into the world. That release, CO2, environmental damage, soil destruction, is now feedbacking into us. That damage is not ignorable now. That damage is now feedbacking into us. So when we talk about this being a substantive transformation, it's a substantive transformation in how we live. Yeah, these are all the kind of even our most ambitious pledges where they currently take us. Yeah, it's between this is 2.7 to 3.1 degrees in our current policy landscape. But I think there's even other, and that's at the conservative level, what the projections are. So I want to keep framing this. Like, this is again work that we're doing in Denmark Denmark has already run out of its carbon budgets. Yet if I talk to their pension funds, if you look at their total carbon budget, they've already gone. It's already finished. And they still say, oh, we're going to build some real estate. And so where are you building this from? And they are signatories to the Paris Accord. So I'm saying this because I think these conversations are now coming to roost. And one thing I will say that's very hopeful is certainly people like central bankers are starting to understand that this is no longer like a marginal game. This is a game which will destroy financial stability from their perspective. And we're seeing energy ministries start to understand these limits now. So we are seeing these conversations now become material. But I think it's really important that all of us are having these sorts of conversations, not just a few elite in a few elite rooms. Because I think it's in the comprehension of this that we start to understand the scale of what's required. And I think it's really critical that we see carbon and in the context of other things. For me, and this is just my perspective, CO2 is just a symptom. Our release of CO2 is a symptom of a much deeper problem. It's a problem with our relationship with the planet. And our relationship with the planet is based on externalizing vast amounts of sort of pollutants and other things into the world, whether toxins or whether biodiversity losses. It's a fundamental misrelationship with the planet. And it was largely ignorable because the planet was relatively infinite for a period in our minds. And now that infiniteness has become a small world scenario where those ignorabilities are no longer there because we're getting feedback. That feedback is social, cultural, weather system breakdown, all these things are feedback. You've all got microplastics inside your bloodstream. Now, I say that, you all know it, you kind of go, yeah, yeah. But that's a function of how we relate to the planet and a function of that relationship. Again, this was reports that you've probably seen. I'm not going to spend so much time on it, but why I say this is these sort of numbers that you often hear, these are manifest in those maps that I showed earlier, because we lose human niche zones. What do they really start to mean? We also are starting to see volatility, and this is, again, goes back to my point. The biggest thing is climate breakdown is loss of predictability. Now, this is where it gets interesting for the finance people in the room, that what that means, the loss of predictability means the loss of insurability. The loss of insurability means the loss of capital markets. Now, you're seeing that already in places like Nova Scotia. You're seeing that where the weather systems have basically meant a house, you cannot get an insurance on a house. You're seeing that in parts of Australia where the insurance on a house, yearly insurance of a house, is over 500,000 Australian dollars. Yearly insurance. Because they're expecting it to burn down pretty much every year. So you're seeing that in places like Florida, and you're seeing that also places like California. So this stuff is now in the system at the macroeconomic level is being understood. Thank you. Is being understood from that lens all the way down, and I think it's really critical for us to recognize that. So, my point: climate breakdown, loss of predictability, loss of predictability, loss of insurability, loss of capital markets. Now, why this is important is that this starts to have a different type of conversation with all of our finance people. Fundamentally changes the terms of the games and the nature of the conversation, because that means that actually those markets start to die very quickly. And why I say all this is, I think the big challenge that we've all got is what are our interventions and what is the relevance, strategic relevance to them, to the scale of what we're talking about. Now, my thing here is not to say, I'm not here to sort of say, I'm not here to scare everyone. What I'm here to do is largely to say, look, let us see the challenge and be great enough to rise to the challenge. My biggest worry is people who stand up there. Yesterday I was in a room and somebody was saying, we got this sorted. We could just, technology will do this, 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 this. My worry was, unfortunately, I wish it was so, but it's not. The numbers aren't taking us there. And they would say, well, at least it's something. And I'm like, no, all it is a delusion till we die. And this is really important. It's a kind of a soft, it's like me giving you, hey, it's going to be all right, knowing that you're going to die. And we're going to be mutually supporting ourselves to that termination. So it is an invitation. This conversation is an invitation to actually operate at the right scale of problem. And we've done things at scales of maybe not the similar magnitude, but we've done things of scales that are outside marginal fixed system markets. Marginal fixed system markets, which I think are really important. So again, if we start to look at what this means, that means that we are going to have to move our economy and society towards intangibles, non-material driven systems. Care, complexity, complex cognition. This thing here, right? This is an experience of human interaction. This will become more valuable. We're going to have to shift our materiality towards massive durability, right? So if you're building a building, you won't build a building out of timber and just say it's timber building, it's fine. You'll say, right, how does a timber building become a 200-year building? And then what's an asset class of a 200-year building where the programs will be different? So it's not a category A office. It's a building that's going to be there for 200 years and the program will evolve. So we have to reimagine the financial asset classes and all those things. We're going to have to build towards a fully biomaterial economy, but that will require us to change our food nutrition systems to be able to unleash that landscape. And that's going to take time. We're going to have to build a new human economy. This work and the brilliant setting of Sarah and Emmy, for me, was actually an invitation for us to be all radically human with each other. Because only in that space of radical humanity and discovering that humanity can we build the context and build the shared pathways to work this stuff together. And also with, whether it's AI and all this sort of stuff, it's about unleashing a new humanity. And that humanity is at the center of an embodied intelligence. Care, complexity, complex cognition, dialogic. My intelligence is not mine, it's a function of dialogues and readings. It's a relational idea, not a possessive idea. So if we see ourselves from that relational idea, we become a different part. It requires us to understand ourselves differently. I'm really sorry about these graphics. So, for example, Britain is not a boundary. We think of it like that because we conceived of it like that. But Britain is a part of a global knot of flows. We are currently reliant on Kenyan soil. We're currently reliant on South African soil. We're currently reliant on minerals around the world. So how do we operate in care and stewardship of a knot of systems when Britain has to acknowledge its role as being part of a system? We are all parts of that system. Everything I wear is not a function of my local, it's a function of being part of a planetary relationship. How do I embody that? How do I govern into that? How do I actually talk about that? But also remember this, right? We have to get our material economy, right? So in this context, we have to get our material economy. Everyone talks about circularity. It's really 4%. Denmark, which is the most advanced circular economy probably still out there. You get better responses in what I would call sort of global south environments, but in the advanced economies, 4%. That's the level of circularity. We have to get to 97. And it's not about scaring us, it's about recognizing the scale of this transformation and how deeply it invites us to be transformed. So a new response is required, and I'm going to sort of speed through this sort of stuff as 2 minutes. Yeah. So Emmy already talked about this. I think we have to recognize the entanglement of value. Again, an underperforming house or a private house which induces costs in terms of actually, whereas air quality, we know air quality, and Centric Lab do some brilliant work around this. A big shout out to them, to my friends there. But like, again, air quality is 5 times worse than indoor air quality is 5 times worse than outdoor air quality. It has massive implications on cognitive performance of children, all sorts of things that are on the table. So how do we start to recognize these entanglements in different formats? How do we start to recognize, do you know why Sheffield chopped down their trees? Do you know why they did it? Accounting. It was accounting that was the basis. Because in terms of trees, their maintenance costs and their insurance costs are known, but the benefits aren't. So what it was cheaper to do was chop down the trees after 10 years and replant some new trees. That's what the council kept saying, but we're going to plant some new trees. And it was like, no, but the benefits of trees really accrue after 40 years. And that's because you don't account for it. You're making maintenance-orientated decisions by a PPP contractor, because that was what they were optimized for. But that's because we don't include, that's why, was it 97% of trees are planted on male trees? Do you know that? That's because, actually, they are lower maintenance. However, they introduce vast amounts of asthma into our system. So they're lower maintenance, but they are higher healthcare costs. So we have to live in a world of entanglements. We know that a tree-lined street will reduce temperatures by 12.5 degrees. We know that's going to be critical in terms of dealing with actually the adaptation of scenarios that we're looking at. So we have to start to reimagine the value of things at a much more structural level. Again, this is just some work that we did around the High Line and other ways of showing some of that stuff. I'm just conscious of time. This is the price of the shirt thing. So, you know when I talked about the 250 shirt? Now imagine the price of a house. If you would do a true cost analysis. I think that's a piece of work we should do. And the reason why I think we should do that piece of work is because it will challenge our idea of how we own and govern this stuff. It will challenge all those ideas. And I think we'll have to start to think more radically about some of this stuff. I'm going to jump through. Yeah, just looking at Imi. Yeah. So, okay, I'm going to do this. Fine. So, look, I think this is a very draft list that we're running internally. So if we talk about cities and places, we're going to have to start to think about actually not just how we own land, but how we steward land. So if you put plastic grass outside, you've basically, yes, you've reduced your maintenance costs, but you've massively destroyed the ecological systems of that environment, right? You've made that choice. You're killing the soil effectively as well over time. How do you actually build a new type of relationship with owning and stewarding a house, which is outside the possession? Remember, property rights means the right to abuse. To make something property, this is philosophically important. To make something property, I have to turn it and make it a boundary, make it an object. Then I have to be able to enslave it to my needs, i.e. it is dead, it is mine. And then, in that deadness, I can extract what I want. Our theory of property has constructed a worldview that has allowed for the deadening of the world and the extraction of certain things, and that builds a particular type of relationship. So we have to start to think, we're going to have to build shared provisions. Like, it is not, we are more and more going to be living in the use of shared provisions like we had in Victorian areas and other things, because actually it's the most effective way of building those utilities. We're going to have to use our public realm much more as a shared public realm, as a usable environment. We're going to have to talk about architecture not being dominant single-use architecture, but programmable architecture, which changes and evolves over time. We're going to have to talk about, if we're going to build new buildings, it's going to be on rooftops of existing buildings, and they're going to be super lightweight construction, probably textiles and timber in different formats with different forms of usability. We're going to have to reduce, we're going to have to talk about much more tiny homes. I think it's been talked about, it's private sufficiency, public luxury. How do we start to reduce our capacity for material demands? We're going to have to talk about comforts, you know, shifting our theory of comfort from buildings providing comfort to clothes providing comfort, right? We just don't have the materiality to keep massively increasing our material size. Just to give you one thing, like the construction of buildings around us, I was talking to a structural engineer, and Smith's in the room, so I'm going to defer as well to that, but is that our buildings are virtually 90% over-engineered. You could reduce materiality by up to 90% because of actually the standards we've built. So how do we start to think about our material uses in fundamentally different ways? How do you start to shift air quality improvements, reduce light pollution, reduce noise pollution, improve the microbiomes of our environments, new materiality that's required? This is a different urban and architectural future, and it has massive changes. I'm going to jump through stuff. Okay, and it also requires, yeah, one last moment. So it also requires, I think, a different form of relationship with the world around us, right? You're already seeing different forms of relationship with nature. This is, I think, a beautiful quote, right? Indigenous people in Taiwan, what they say about actually their relationship with borrowing the materials from the river to give back. How do we have a different relationship with the world? And I think that's going to be very, very critical. And also our relationship with territory and land might be different. And also, what does that mean for crazy things like embassies of the North Seas, self-sovereignty of the things around us? How do we start to move from a dominant ownership model position to a treaty relationship with the world of things, of human and non-human machine things, but also ecological things. How do we operate in a new theory of governance? How do we start to operate into this whole future? And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.